We got some economic news today. I think the big news on the day was the revised numbers for the fourth quarter GDP for the U.S. economy. Now, the forecast by all the economists was that the economy grew by 3.3% in the fourth quarter. And, of course, this is after the fourth quarter is already over, right? The economists were estimating that the growth was 3.3%. Now, as it turns out, the growth was only 2.8%. So it was off by a pretty significant percentage, right, more than 20%. But this is making an estimate based on a quarter that's already finished, okay? So my point is President Obama's 10-year budget forecast, where he claims we're going to save $1.1 trillion over 10 years, is based on what they think GDP growth is going to be for 10 years. And this is making an estimate in advance. Yet economists don't even know what the GDP was going backwards. They can't even figure out what the fourth quarter GDP was after the fourth quarter is over. So how are they going to know what the GDP is going to be for 10 years that haven't even taken place? And, of course, if we end up getting a 10-year average of 2.8 as opposed to about the 3.3, because that's about what Obama is estimating for the next 10 years, what they thought we were going to get last quarter. But if they're off by the same percentage and it's only 2.8, my bet is that we get no reduction in the deficit over those 10 years. In fact, it probably increases if we get 2.8% growth. We need that 3.3% growth, which is, again, about 50% faster than the economy grew in the decade before the financial crisis of 2008. But now, for all of 2010, I think the economy grew about 2.8% as well for the entire year of 2010. And that is all the growth we were able to muster, and phony growth, with QE2, with 0% interest rates, with all the stimulus thrown out this economy. That's all we were able to do. If you look at the debt, I was looking at some of these statistics. President Obama has now added $3.5 trillion of debt in the 2 years he's been president. That's it. I mean, 2 years, the national debt has grown by $3.5 trillion. Now, contrast that to George Bush. George Bush grew the debt by $4.9 trillion, but it took him 8 years. Now, that's still a lot. That's an average of $600 billion a year that George Bush added to the deficit. Well, Obama is adding $1.75 trillion per year to the deficit. That's 3 times the rate at which Bush added. And, of course, Bush was the biggest deficit spender of them all. Now, if you put it in perspective, this year alone, the budget deficit is going to, we're going to add to the national debt this year the same amount that was added from George Washington to the end of Ronald Reagan's first term. And, in fact, for the 2 years, the amount of debt that Obama has added in 2 years, we didn't have a national debt of $3.5 trillion until about the first term of Bill Clinton. That's how long it took the government to rack up $3.5 trillion. It took about 200 years, and President Obama did it in 2 years. I guess that's the kind of change, right? He's adding debt at 100 times the speed at which we were able to do it in the past. Now, one of the things that's interesting, you might think, gee, the debt is increasing by 1.75 trillion a year for those 2 years. The budget deficits haven't been that high. That's true, because the budget deficits are not the actual debt. It's what the government claims it's borrowing. But the natural debt is what it's actually borrowing, because some of the stuff is off budget. For example, every single year that Bill Clinton was president, the national debt increased. Even though they claim that they had some budget surpluses, they weren't real surpluses. Every year, Bill Clinton added to the debt by borrowing money. Anyway, don't go away. We'll continue with this topic after the commercial breaks. This is Peter Schiff on SchiffRadio.com.
It's the last time you're gonna hurt me.
The Peter Schiff Show. To President Obama, Secretary Geithner, Madam Pelosi, and all of the socialist econ professors across America, we're sorry. Peter Schiff is back on the air.
back, everybody. This is Peter Schiff on SchiffRadio.com. You know, before the break, I was starting to talk about the fallacy in the budget deficit numbers and that the national debt is growing much faster than the accumulation of the acknowledged budget deficits. And that is because not all the debt that is incurred is on budget. So when the debt is incurred off budget, it doesn't show up in the official budget deficit numbers, but it does show up in the national debt, because even if it's off budget, the money still has to be borrowed in order for it to be spent. So if you really want to know the fiscal position during the year, don't simply look at what the government claims the budget deficit was. Take the year-over-year increase in the national debt, and then you'll know exactly how much money the government borrowed during the year. And of course, though, even those figures don't tell the whole story, because it doesn't include obligations that are not official obligations of the U.S. government, such as guaranteed mortgages by Freddie and Fannie or guaranteed student loans. These are all debts that the U.S. government owes, but they are contingent liabilities, and the contingency liabilities do not show up in the national debt numbers. But still, the national debt itself is a much better estimate of how much we borrowed as a nation directly than is the official numbers that the government acknowledges. You know, also out today, there's a report from the IMF, and even the IMF is saying that they don't believe President Obama, that his numbers are not credible, that his deficit reduction plan over the next 10 years will not reduce the deficit by the amount claimed. And of course, even if it did, it's too little. We need much more significant reductions than the minute, the tiny reductions that President Obama claims he's made. And of course, he hasn't even made them, because they're based on a set of phony economic assumptions that has no chance of actually coming to fruition.